My mother died on a Tuesday, and I found out from a Facebook post my sister made. 3 hours after the funeral home had already come to take her body. She didn't call me. She didn't text me. 9 days later, in a lawyer's office full of relatives who all turned to stare at me, I heard the one line she'd written about her only daughter. I leave her nothing, because I gave her nothing while I lived, and I see no reason to change that now. Everyone in that room expected me to cry quietly and disappear. What none of them expected, what even I didn't expect, was a small wooden box, hidden away under a strange, private instruction that would arrive in my life 3 weeks later and undo everything I thought I understood about the woman who raised me. Stay until the end, because what was inside that box was never supposed to see the light of day. My name is Diane. I'm 51, and for as long as I can remember, my mother, Eleanor, treated me like an inconvenience she never asked for. My younger sister, Patricia, came 4 years after me, and from the moment she was born, something in my mother softened toward her that never once softened toward me. Patricia got the birthday parties, the piano lessons, the easy affection that seemed to come to her without effort. I got chores, criticism, and report cards that were never quite good enough. I remember being 7, bringing home 4 A's and 1 B, and my mother looking only at that single B and saying, "Patricia would never bring home a B." Patricia was 3 years old. She wasn't even in school yet. It didn't matter. I'd already been sorted into the wrong category. When I was 12, I stood outside my parents' bedroom and heard my mother on the phone with a neighbor, saying I was the child she never wanted. I stood in that hallway for what felt like an hour, and I never told a soul. I just quietly filed it away as fact, the way children do when an adult says something devastating, in a tone that isn't meant to be questioned. My father died when I was 16, and whatever thin buffer he'd provided between my mother's coldness and me disappeared with him. Patricia got a car for her 17th birthday. I got a part-time job, and a mother who told me, the day I left for community college, "Well, I suppose you'll figure it out. You always were the independent one." It wasn't a compliment. It was relief, disguised as one. I left home at 18, built a life 200 miles away, a husband, 2 kids, a small accounting business grown from a folding table in my spare bedroom. My mother came to my wedding, sat in the second row, and left after 40 minutes, citing a headache. Patricia's wedding, 6 years later, she helped plan for a year and a half and cried through the entire ceremony. I called on Mother's Day. I sent cards on her birthday. Most calls lasted under 2 minutes. "I'm busy," she'd say, even with the television clearly playing in the background. Patricia, meanwhile, stayed close, visited every Sunday, and became, in every visible way, the daughter our mother actually wanted. I told myself I'd made peace with it, that I'd built something better 200 miles away and didn't need her approval anymore. Grief doesn't ask permission before it arrives, though. When my phone rang at 6:40 that morning, and I saw Patricia's name on the screen, some old, buried part of me, the 12-year-old still standing in that hallway, already knew that whatever quiet hope I'd been holding on to had just run out of time. The will was read 9 days after the funeral, in a cramped office belonging to a tired lawyer named Mr. Halbrook. Patricia sat beside her husband, dressed for a business meeting rather than a funeral. I sat alone, the way I'd sat alone at most family gatherings for 30 years. The house, valued at just under $300,000, to Patricia. The savings, just under $400,000, to Patricia. The jewelry, including our grandmother's wedding ring, the car, the china, all to Patricia. And then, finally, my line. The line you already heard, read aloud in front of a family who'd spent decades believing I was the cold one, the distant one, The daughter who never tried hard enough to earn her mother's affection. I remember the specific silence that followed. Not shocked silence, but the silence of a room that had already known what was coming and was simply waiting to watch me react to it. Patricia didn't even look uncomfortable. She looked relieved, like a fight she'd spent years dreading was finally, mercifully behind her. An uncle across the room actually nodded, as though the will had merely confirmed something everyone already understood to be fair. I stood, thanked Mr. Halbrook for his time, in a voice steadier than I felt, and walked out, before anyone in that room could watch my face crumble. I made it to my car before the tears came, and I sat there for nearly 40 minutes, engine off, hands still on the wheel, feeling 51 and 12 years old at exactly the same time. I told myself that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, Mr. Halbrook called me directly. There was a separate item, he explained, never listed in the public reading. A small, sealed wooden box my mother had brought to his office 8 months before she died, under one unusual instruction: give this to Diane, and only Diane, if she ever comes to ask for it herself. Some tired, bitter part of me wanted to let it rot in a filing cabinet forever, the same way my relationship with her had rotted for 51 years without anyone intervening. Why go asking for anything else from a woman who'd just publicly, permanently confirmed I meant nothing to her? But Mr. Halbrook added one more detail that stopped me cold. I've handled estates for 22 years, Mrs. Whitfield. I have never seen a client cry the way your mother cried in this office. 2 hours, writing and rewriting that one instruction, terrified you'd misread her intentions, even after she was gone. That detail didn't fit anywhere in the story I'd told myself about my mother. The woman I knew didn't cry over me. The woman I knew didn't agonize over how I'd interpret anything. Against every defensive instinct I'd built over 3 decades, curiosity, or maybe some last, stubborn hope, got the better of me, and I told him I'd come. I drove back alone the following week, telling Mark only that I needed to handle one more piece of paperwork, unwilling, even then, to admit how much I was afraid of hoping for anything. Mr. Halbrook handed me the box without ceremony. Small, plain, sealed with simple twine. He told me gently that he had no idea what was inside. My mother had never let him see the contents, only the note taped to the lid. Please don't ask her about this. Just give it to her, and let her decide what to do with it. I carried it to my car and drove 200 miles home without remembering a single mile of the road. I set it on my kitchen table that evening, made a cup of tea I never drank, and sat there long after Mark had gone to bed, staring at it, afraid of what closing 30 years of distance might actually require of me. Around 11 that night, I finally lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bundled by year, every one addressed, for Diane, when she's ready. The oldest was dated the year I turned 12, the same year I'd overheard her call me the child she never wanted. My hands were shaking as I opened it. In it, in her careful, slanted handwriting, she wrote that she'd said those words to a neighbor out of shame, not truth. That same year, she'd been quietly diagnosed with a severe anxiety disorder she never told a single soul about, one compounded by what her doctor called acute perfectionistic dread, a fear so consuming she couldn't stand to be near me, her most watchful child, without feeling like I could see straight through every crack in her composure. Patricia never triggered that fear in her, because Patricia never watched her that closely. I did. I always had, and my mother mistook my attentiveness for judgment, punishing me for noticing what she couldn't control. Letter after letter peeled back another year. She wrote about quiet therapy she'd started in her 40s, and abandoned after 6 sessions, convinced she didn't deserve the relief it offered. She wrote about the afternoon I left for college, how she'd driven to a rest stop 40 minutes outside of town and sobbed alone for an hour before turning the car around, because she couldn't bear for me to see how much my leaving actually devastated her. She wrote about sitting outside my apartment once, years later, working up the courage to knock and apologize, and driving away instead because she'd convinced herself I'd slam the door in her face the moment she tried. A second, entirely different mother was emerging from those pages, not absent by cruelty, but absent by an illness she never had the courage to name, even to herself, let alone to the daughter, who spent 30 years mistaking her silence for indifference. Near the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, I found a folder I'd almost missed entirely, tucked flat against the base. Inside it was a property deed for a small lake house in Michigan, dated 11 years earlier. A house I had never once heard mentioned in 51 years of family conversation. The deed was in my name, not Patricia's, mine. The letter attached to it explained everything. 11 years before, my mother had come into a modest inheritance of her own, money from a great aunt neither Patricia nor I had ever known well. Rather than folding it into the estate she knew would eventually go to Patricia by default, given how close they'd grown, she'd used it to quietly purchase a small lake house in my name alone, placed in a trust her lawyer had drafted, without ever knowing its true emotional purpose, only its legal one. She'd been paying the property taxes and minimal upkeep on that house for over a decade, in complete silence, telling no one, not her lawyer, not Patricia, not a single friend, specifically so nothing about it could ever become another source of family conflict before I was ready to receive it on my own terms. "I know you'll read the will first," she wrote, in a passage I've read perhaps 30 times since. "I know it will say I left you nothing, and I need you to understand that line was never really true. It was the only way I knew how to protect this from becoming another battlefield between you and your sister. I couldn't give you a mother who showed up right. I could at least give you a door somewhere quiet, waiting for you, whenever you needed one." I sat at that table until nearly 4 in the morning, reading every letter twice, tracing 11 years of a secret my mother had carried entirely alone. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, I stopped being angry and started grieving something else entirely. Not her death, but the 30 years she'd spent building a version of love she was too afraid to say out loud, choosing silence and a hidden deed over one honest conversation, convinced somewhere along the way that hiding her care was safer than risking its rejection. I called Patricia the next morning, my voice barely steady, and read her a single paragraph from the earliest letter. For the first time in either of our adult lives, my sister cried on the phone with me instead of at me. She hadn't known any of it, not the diagnosis, not the abandoned therapy, not the lake house, none of it. "She told me you never tried," Patricia admitted quietly, her voice cracking. "She told me for years you'd pulled away first, that she only ever wanted to be close to you, and you wouldn't let her." Our mother had let both of her daughters believe 2 entirely different, incomplete stories for 30 years. Apparently convinced the full truth would only cause more damage than her silence already had. Patricia drove 200 miles to see me that same weekend, something she'd never once done in 30 years of adult life. We sat at my kitchen table and went through the rest of the box together, piecing apart 3 decades of a story neither of us had the full picture of alone. "She let me be the good daughter," Patricia said quietly, staring at the deed, "because being the good daughter with me was easy. She never had to work for it. This is the only time she ever really worked for anything, for either of us, and she did it entirely for you, and she was too scared to tell either of us why. She offered, unprompted, to split the sale of our mother's house evenly with me, regardless of what the will said. For the first time in either of our adult lives, We weren't negotiating around our mother's absence. We were finally on the same side of something. 6 months later, Mark and I drove up to see the lake house for the first time. Small, weathered, badly in need of new gutters, sitting on a quiet stretch of shoreline in northern Michigan. I stood on that dock the first evening we arrived and cried for nearly 20 minutes, not out of grief exactly, but out of something closer to finally being seen by a woman who never once managed to say the right words to my face while she was alive. I keep that wooden box of letters in the closet of that lake house now, and every summer I bring one or two out and read them again on that same dock, slowly working through a story she was too afraid to tell me in real time. She couldn't love me out loud. She never learned how. But she left me the one inheritance she was brave enough to leave. Proof, 11 years in the making, that I mattered to her far more than either of us ever had the courage to say. If this story moved you, if you've ever had to piece together a parent's real love, long after it was too late to hear it from them directly, tell me in the comments. The truth doesn't always arrive on time, but it arrives anyway, and that has to count for something. Subscribe for more stories like Diane's, and I'll see you in the next one.